Okay, so let's start with some cell membrane power notes. Power notes are just like simple, short, to the point, just basic information. We'll fill in the details a little bit later. So, we want to talk about the functions of the cell membrane. Obviously, we realize that it contains the cell contents and controls what enters and exits the cell. So, you've got all of your organelles over here embedded in the cytoplasm, which we call the cytosol. And then you can see that there is a barrier between the outside and the inside of the cell. And so, there are molecules embedded, proteins embedded in the bilayer that allow it to control what can enter and exit the cell based on the cell's needs. So the phospholipids are the major component of the cell membrane. Of course, we've talked about this when we looked at lipids in our biomolecule unit. And so remember that these molecules form the bilayer, just like in the previous slide. You can see that there are multiples of them. And this is going to be a three-dimensional structure, so there's going to be more than one layer. There's going to be thousands of molecules next to each other. The phospholipid consists of what we call the phosphate head, which is the phosphorus with the four oxygens here. That's the PO4 group, and two fatty acid tails here. The phosphate PO4 head is polar, and it's going to be attracted to water and form hydrogen bonds with the water, both on the inside and outside of the cell. So the inside aqueous solution and the outside extracellular fluid, phospholipid heads are always going to be in contact with that fluid. The tails are nonpolar, therefore they are hydrophobic. They're going to turn away from the water, which is what gives the membrane, going back to this diagram, bilayer structure. So you can see the fatty acid tails face the inside, always turned away from the water. Scientists use the term fluid mosaic model to describe the structure of the cell membrane. So the fluid part, it basically just describes the arrangement of molecules that make up the membrane. So you can see in this diagram, you've got phospholipids, you've got different types of transport proteins, both integral and peripheral. We see other different types of molecules. So it's like a mosaic of several different pieces, much like mosaic art seen in this diagram. And it's flexible like a fluid. And so, again, that's just the way the scientists describe that arrangement of molecules in the membrane. Some of the other molecules that we'll touch on in more detail in our later lessons are cholesterol. We mentioned that. Cholesterol is a steroid. It functions to strengthen the membrane and help keep it fluid. So, in increasingly cold temperatures, the phospholipids can't pack onto themselves, and increasingly warm temperatures, the cholesterol keeps them from spreading out too far, thus holding the membrane together basically so that it doesn't burst, because if it bursts, then the cell dies. We also have various different types of proteins that aid in cell identification and transporting the molecules across the membrane into and out of the cell. And sometimes attached to those peripheral proteins are carbohydrate chains, and those aid in cell identification as well. We call those glycoproteins. So here we go. Here's what I was speaking of just a second ago. So here's the carbohydrate chain attached to an embedded protein, and that would be a glycoprotein. That's like a little name tag that says, "Hi, my name is." Here you can see the cholesterol. There's not a lot of cholesterol, just here and there. But again, that keeps those phospholipids from spreading out or packing too tightly, kind of giving it some additional shape and structure. The membrane is described as being selectively permeable or semi-permeable. Basically, it's going to allow select materials to cross the membrane based on the size of openings. So you can see here in this, very simple diagram that this particular membrane has openings through it, but the red blood cells are too large, and so they can't pass through. But whatever these other little molecules are able to. This allows the cell to maintain homeostasis, and molecules can cross in a variety of ways, and that's, again, something we're going to talk about later in our lessons. Just a little bit about receptors. Receptors are a type of protein embedded in the cell membrane that basically will detect a signal molecule. Here it's called a ligand, and this will be later in our units, and it will cause the cell to perform an action in response. So this particular chemical messenger can't cross the membrane, so it has to bind to a receptor. This binding will then cause a cascade of events to happen, causing a cellular response. That's cell-to-cell communication. But I still wanted to kind of introduce it since it is one of the functions of membrane proteins. These receptors can be intracellular, which means they're located inside the cell. They'll bind to molecules that can cross the membrane, such as steroid hormones like estrogen and testosterone. And then you can have receptors that are embedded in the membrane, like in the diagram I just showed you, like located in the membrane. They'll bind to molecules that can't cross the membrane, like protein-based hormones like insulin, which will then cause a cellular response. Change the shape interior, transmit the message. All right, so that does it, and we'll review some more of this in our next lesson.